Hello, and welcome to the first module of Offensive Security, BackTrack Basics. In this module we'll get familiar with BackTrack and we'll see how to operate various services. We'll start by logging on to BackTrack with the username root and password TOOR, that's T-O-O-R. In order to start a graphical session, we can type in either flux, which will give us a Fluxbox session, or startx, which will give us a KDE session. Now, if you've come this far, I assume you already know what the BackTrack Live CD is all about, and no more introductions are needed. Before we actually start bashing away at our keyboard, I'd like to quickly review the CD layout and the basic features. The BackTrack Live CD attempts to be intuitive in the tool layout. However, there are several important things that we need to keep in mind. For starters, not all of the tools available on the CD are represented in the KDE or Fluxbox menu. Generally speaking, try to avoid using the KDE menu, at least for training purposes. Once you get to know the tools and the basic command line options, then you can indulge yourself in laziness and actually use the menu. Most of our analysis and penetration testing tools are located either in the path or in the /pentest directory. The tools in the /pentest directory are categorized and subcategorized into different attack vectors. Take some time to explore the pentest directory so you get familiar with the tools available. As Abe Lincoln once said, if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 3 sharpening my axe. How very true. So let's just take a quick look at the KDE menu that BackTrack has to offer. And most of the penetration testing tools available on the CD can be accessed via this menu. The arrangement of the tools, again, as I said, tries to be intuitive and actually go through the flow of the penetration test. So the first thing we actually see is all the enumeration or reconnaissance tools, and so on. Now, if we actually go and peek into the /pentest directory, then you'll see that most of the entries in the menu are there. However, there are some entries which aren't, such as housekeeping and other subcategorized tools. BackTrack includes several useful network services such as HTTPD, an Apache server, SSHD, an SSH server, TFTPD, a VNC server, and several others. These services may be useful in various situations, for example, setting up a TFTP server to transfer files to or from a victim. Now, before you actually try using these servers, you need to verify you have a valid IP address. The final version of BackTrack doesn't actually attempt to get an IP address automatically from the network using DHCP. This is for reasons of extra stealthiness which we might want during a pen test. So, depending on your network, you'll either be assigned an address by DHCP or you'll need to assign one statically. DHCP is actually rather easy to operate. You just need to type in DHCP CD ETH 0 or your respective network interface. And that was quick. If I do a quick ifconfig, I will see that I was indeed assigned an IP address from my DHCP server. To assign yourself an address manually, I'd suggest using the command line rather than relying on any graphical or cursors-based interface. The commands you need to give are as follows: ifconfig, the network interface, the IP address and the subnet mask in CIDR form. The next thing you need to do is assign yourself a default gateway, GW, and the IP address of the gateway. And the last thing you probably need to do is enter a DNS server for your connection. So we can do that by shoving the following entry into the etc resolve.conf file, and hopefully we should now have internet connectivity, assuming this computer is indeed connected to the internet. Wonderful. Before you actually start setting up any services, I strongly recommend to change the default password to something a bit more complex. This is so nasty people won't connect to your computer and hack you. So let's just do that. We'll type in passwd and change to a really complex password. There we go. Now that we're relatively secure, let's start opening ports on our machine. Let's start with the SSH server, a very useful service which can help us either for remote administration or SSH tunneling attacks. Before the SSH server is started for the first time, SSH keys need to be generated. We can do this by giving the sshd generate command. Once the SSH keys are generated, we can actually start the server, which is located in /user sbin sshd. There. Now we should have an SSH server up and running locally. We can actually check this using the netstat command. And we can actually see that port 22 is listening. Let's move on to our HTTP server, Apache. We can use Apache for several things: to publish a website, to start a client-side attack, or to download files to a victim. It's all up to you, of course. To start the Apache server, we can issue the Apache CTL command. And to start the server, we'll give a start. And again, if we check that port 80 is listening, we should see that it is. And indeed it is. And to stop the HTTP server, we'll again issue the Apache CTL command and a stop. And there you go. Let's try setting up the TFTPD server. TFTPD server can be useful in several situations, especially ones where you need to transfer files to or from a victim machine. To start the TFTP server, just type in the following commands: atftpd. Let's start it in daemon mode on port 69, and let's give a root directory /tmp. Again, let's verify that the TFTP server is indeed listening. And indeed it is. The last service we'll be examining is the VNC server. VNC is especially useful for remote administration or tunneling VNC connections. Starting the VNC server is relatively simple. You just type in VNC server, and you should be prompted for a password. So let's give a complex password. Around 8 characters should be enough. There, the VNC server is started. Now, one thing you need to note is that VNC starts itself on port 5901 and successively increases the port number with each session that you open. So to connect to this machine, you'd actually need to set your client to connect to port 5901. We can just verify that again using the netstat command. Alright, so just make sure you connect to this port number. We've come to the end of this module, and in the next module we'll be talking about the modularity features of BackTrack, and we'll learn how to integrate our own tools and scripts into the live CD.